as we're waiting for people to trickle in, let's do what we did yesterday at the start of class. So, those of you that haven't introduced yourself yet, if you could say hi and tell us. Actually, I'm going to change the prompt today. Tell us a little bit about yourself, but not why you took the class, but what in the readings we've done. Now we've done 3 days of readings, and I know this is a lot. Usually, I do one class like this a week, so I know you're reading a lot, and it's not lost on me that there's a lot going on. But which concept has resonated most with you in the last 3 days of readings that you've done? I like how you're nodding your head. You're like, please don't call on me. I'm not going to call on anybody, but I'm just going to tell you that every day the prompts are going to get even more involved. So if you want to get, although there isn't that many days to go, but if you want to get this out of the way, now's a good time to just say hi, tell me what you work on. And we've been working on projects. I'm guessing the two of you have seen the videos. Have you both seen the videos? Okay, so this is day one for you. Wonderful. Who wants to get started? Now that I've called you out, you have to start.
So as I was speaking yesterday also, as when I was looking at the critique.
I didn't tell us your name, so everyone remembers.
Sorry, Professor. So my name is Anvesh Baki.
Nice to meet you.
So I graduated from Nalsar in 2021. Then I did my LLM. I'm working as a faculty at a private university.
Is Sai here?
No, it's in Chennai, Professor.
You came from Madras to come here to listen to me. That's amazing.
It's owned by one of the board members is, by the way, Narayan Murthy. So yeah.
I don't know what to
do. To be working there. So so with regards to the readings, as I was mentioning yesterday also, with critiques of liberal critiques of human rights.
Yeah.
As such, when we were looking at
the Ratna Kapoor reading. Yeah.
So yeah, I think I was able to connect it more with the paradoxes of Hawaiian sovereignty and how we should look beyond the state formations and laws and legal institutions and categorizations. But I found it difficult to understand what exactly the freedom Ratna Kapoor was.
Oh my God, that's the piece that always comes back to anybody who uses that theory. This is great. We don't want the structure, but what is freedom? And so queer theorists would. Oh my God, thank you. Thank you. Why are you making people do this?
I don't make anybody do
this. Thank you so much. That's the piece that feels gritty, right? What do we do with the with freedom as a concept? Because freedom feels so expansive, and we can understand why liberal limits of the law are problematic, but what do you see beyond it? And I think that's like even questioning whether freedom is possible is a kind of liberal mentality to understand these concepts, in a sense, right? So you could argue that what Kapoor is using as freedom is a invitation to think about possibilities that are not yet seen. So anything that is unimagined is freedom. That's one reading, right? Like that reading is available. So that you could totally read it and say, you haven't given us a framework for how freedom works, and therefore this is not available or possible. And I think one way in which freedom works is exactly the sovereignty. Actually, the Hawaiian sovereignty example is excellent, because it's an example of how to think beyond nation state to consider where it is our dignity and our possibility lies. And I think that's the invitation. The invitation is, in any given case, how do we look beyond liberal possibility?
But
sorry. Yeah.
For me, Professor, both from the positions that they're writing.
Yeah.
I mean, Kainanui, if I'm pronouncing their name right.
Yes.
So they're writing from a very indigenous perspective in a settler colonial context.
Correct.
The settler colonizer is a hegemonic or dominance force. But whereas when we look at the Kapoor's reading, it's coming from a context of India, where pre-colonial times we have. I mean, how we see decolonization also something that we can look into. But if you see colonization through the lenses of British coming to India, then the colonization starting, and if we look beyond that, then that would be essentializing the caste practices.
Totally. And it would be a way of assuming that colonization only started with empire, with sort of, at a certain point in time, when in fact there's always been colonization. I think and are you referring particularly to the analogy that she starts the chapter with, the snake and so so a lot of the critique for that piece has also been that it relied on texts that reinforce certain systems that are problematic. And I actually think it's a helpful way to use it, to consider what it means to read those texts more radically and be like, actually, how do we read unto them and not that there's, like we said yesterday, there's never a pre or a cast, like, impossible system, right? We can imagine it, but it doesn't exist. And that's the problem with utopia. You can imagine it, but you don't know how to actually achieve it. But I think the in a later part of the book, she says, just because this is going to be taken over by, right wing, like, reinforcers of caste hierarchy, does not mean that we don't get to play as radical readers of these texts in different ways with these texts that should be available for interpretation, that are different, right? So almost reading Sanskrit texts or reading texts that were pre-colonial and having this, you're totally right in the critique that this is a decolonial praxis that is still casted, and I would argue everything is casted in that way. But I think there's something quite difficult, and as a scholar, I find difficulty actually helpful as an intellectual practice. There's something quite difficult with playing with a text that is complicated in that way. That you feel like, oh, this is a text that has been used historically to reinforce the caste system. And how do you read Shankara to actually do something different? And those reimaginings, it's a bit like how you were talking about queer readings of the law and queer possibilities of the law. Like, there are the capacities for anti-caste readings for things that have been inherited to do caste in very specific ways. And I don't know how far that I don't know the limits of my own generosity of that reading is there, because I worry that then you can say, well, everything can be read radically and everything can be read with possibility. But as an optimist, I actually want to think that just because something can be co-opted by someone who holds an entirely diametrically opposite position as me does not mean I don't get the chance to play with that text in a useful way. And I think people who read a lot of Islamic, like a lot of radical Islamic law scholars, would make some of the same arguments about the histories of where the origins of these texts come, right? So if you a lot of medievalists would read queerness into histories that have actively not read them into it, precisely for this purpose, because it shouldn't be unavailable to one. Vaishnavi, I've seen you have your hand up, like, through the process. I want to give you the chance to speak.
It's just when I was reading, it's the same thing that came to my mind as well. That okay, we're mentioning alterity and we're mentioning like um, other imaginations of freedom outside the liberal framework, the neoliberal conception
Totally.
of human rights. And but I feel like rather than the point of the reading for me, what spoke to me more than anything else, is rather than listing down, okay, these would be the other explanations of the feeling. I think that would be sort of counterproductive to the reading if they attempted that, because the whole point is to
Open
break
it up.
away
Bless you.
from like um, rigid frameworks of thinking and having a creative outlook of, oh, what can freedom mean for different people. And there's this example of the controversy around hijab, and the liberal human rights framework would see that as if a person wants to wear a hijab, it's necessarily that it's a culturally conditioned thing.
Correct. And they can never not think of it any other way.
So, and this is the whole Amartya Sen Mata, who's born
Yes.
Hindi as well, where she comes and says that, okay, basic freedoms, but what basic freedoms?
And for whom?
Yeah, and for whom? So,
Yeah.
that's sort of my understanding of
It is a very good reading and understanding of it. Did you put your hand up? Oh. Yeah, it's a really good reading of the text. And I think this is the conversation we were having yesterday too, which is like, what do we do with what do we do with expansive utopic imagination, right? Just because it's not we don't have a blueprint for it, does it mean it doesn't exist? Does it mean we don't actually access it? Does it mean it's not real, right? Matsuda's reading about what it means to bring her body to the classroom, for example, right, is also intrinsically about what it means to access things like affect, things like voice, things like subject positionality in a classroom when others think there isn't like a space for it, right? So there's I think there are connections between the, I hope you saw the connections between the Matsuda reading and the Williams reading. And Ratna Kapoor actually, I don't think does that same work. It's a different lineage of where she's going with it. But I find it helpful to sit with that discomfort of like, oh, you're not giving me a full answer. This full answer is not, it, I don't know what to do with this non-full answer, but maybe that discomfort is what we're imagining is, right? So on the last day, I hope we have discussions about what it means to do that kind of imagining when you don't know what it is you're actually asking for, which is, yeah, which I think is hard for legal imagining, but for socio-legal imagining really allows expansiveness. Yeah.
Uh, so, I mean, I get the purpose of the reading of this text, but personally, I did not find it particularly helpful because, I mean, again, I'm coming from a place of very mistrust towards academia and generally academics, where you just theorize endlessly and nothing comes out of that. So I'm coming from that place, so I just wanted to make it clear.
Yeah.
So from the reading, I understood that, okay, there is a lot that is wrong with the Human Rights Project. Fine. I agree with whatever the reasons she says for that. But what next? And I also get that there is that open-ended question, and for all of us to pitch in and think about it in our own ways.
Yeah.
But she also particularly mentions certain things like self-reflection, introspection, transformation, and also I think she deals with political spirituality idea of Foucault. Again, I don't know any of this because I haven't read the entire book, just the introduction.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to understand how these ideas can be alternatives to Human Rights Project, where we're concerned with real material concerns of people.
And just so I understand the critique, is the critique that possible affective spiritual extensions are not material?
Yes, I'm looking at it in that way.
Okay.
To me, it just, I mean, this is very reductionist and dismissive probably.
No, and it's helpful to put it on the table, right? Because if that version of reading it as and it's interesting that that's the first Indian scholar we've like read on like alterity and right, like, so our closeness to what she's dismissing or pushing up also might be a little bit different. But did you have the same critique of Matsuda and Williams talking about affect as non-material?
Not really, because somewhere it felt like they're more humble in what they're saying, which I did not feel about Ratna Kapoor's reading.
And had you encountered Ratna Kapoor's reading before?
No, this was the first time.
And did you know anything about the scholar?
No, I just googled and I read a little bit about them. But
were you colored by Jindal?
Wait, is she a Jindal?
Could be, and also that her entire education was outside the country. Her entire education was outside the country. I don't know, but it just, to me, it felt like, okay, Human Rights Project where we actually talk about material things. For example, say right to minimum wage. All these we speak in the language of human rights, and we are saying, let's keep that aside, move beyond. And then we're talking about self-reflection, we're talking about Mahayana Buddhism. So are we saying we can just meditate our way out of oppression?
Which I guess is an incredibly potent, like, sort of critique to the argument, right? Because it's an individualist critique to a societal structural problem, right? Like it is. Did you have your hand up? I keep missing this side of the room. So tell us.
Because Kranti was saying something, and because of those particular words, introspection, reflection in the Kapoor reading, I was talking yesterday with Anandita and Misbah about it, that when I was reading that piece, something we did again alongside the project that just ended, this was about doing a desk study for female genital mutilation, cutting, the practice of cups practiced in the Bora community, and now again UNFPA as in it wants to kind of like, okay, what exactly can India do about it? So we did not want to go with the legislative. Last time put their hand saying that we are not going to say that make a law.
Yeah.
But Jindal is taking up a like again a separate project where they are wanting to kind of legislate on the subject. But because we did this desk study and as I was involved with the project, and obviously we made a report. We kind of brought in people who are members of the community and people from Jindal who are working on that legislation, and made them say that okay, made them look at our report that okay, we think that this is the articulation that we gave as academics, right? That there is obviously I understand the mistrust with academia in general, but and I wanted to share that that specific part. Besides that, okay, even if you are doing taking a separate project to legislate on the subject, we would suggest use prohibition of the practice, not criminalize. Because the moment
There's more carcerality you're attaching to a
the
thing.
moment you criminalize, you put it in the back alley. You ensure that people will still go ahead with it, but in unsanitary conditions.
That's right.
And the people who will be criminalized would be family members, right? We don't want
And the people who don't have any privilege to come out on bail. Which,
exactly, yeah. And obviously, like it's a small community, knit community, and so many of the people. It's something that whether a person has undergone something like this or not is something that travels by word of mouth. There is no certificate that's there.
Yeah.
Certificate, but like people, it's a small
Knows or
knit
not,
community,
yeah.
that's how
Yeah.
they get to know, right?
That's-
Initially, when they read the report, they were livid. That how are you kind of suggesting prohibit but not criminalize? Because activists have been there because they were these were women who had been affected by it, right? Have spent their entire life wanting to have been outcasts.
Yeah.
Because that community also outcasts and excommunicates.
Totally,
people.
yeah.
So they were initially very angry that how can you say that prohibit but not criminalize? Because it's, again, it becomes like pointless thing, right? But in that period of a closed door meeting, where like 4 hours we kind of try to explain why exactly we use those terminologies.
Yeah.
It is coming from a place, even though we are not people who are embedded in the community, we think that by putting those words, we are taking the discourse forward, but not criminalizing,
Yeah.
which will ultimately impact people who don't have the privilege to come out of the process, right? And considering that how again, the Muslim community, even if like the Audi Bohra Muslim community is like a privileged sector
yeah.
within the Muslims, it's still something like for the Hindu majority
To not have the chance to actually talk about it. Yeah.
So that's how I was thinking of that.
So
The possibility of the academy.
the possibility that I like how that has been put on the bless you. I like how that's been put on the table. But can I actually make a more radical response to that? Like that comes from a totally different perspective as someone that it's like that as someone that is an academic and sort of is in that universe of like theorizing perhaps just for theory's sake. I both see why it can seem really self-fulfilling and navel-gazing and not really productive. But I also have to believe that if you're a professor, some part of these frameworks are helpful to shape how people think about practice. And if we just did non-theoretical interventions, and I've seen this at Taunton schools where one rather than the other has been the focus. And I think if you don't have whether you choose it or not, even to be able to reject theory is actually a really helpful way to do practice. Even if you decide that something doesn't apply in a certain way, or you think, oh, I can't believe self-reflection is the option, right? And I'm talking actually directly to a line of research on mindfulness and the law that's come out of the CRT movement, right? Which, of course, you can dismiss and say there are real people dying. Like, I can't believe you're sitting and thinking about yoga right now, right? But there is a way in which there are limits to practice that can get rejuvenated by thinking differently about theory and having spaces where theory is the end. Actually, not theory for what it can do for practice, where theory is the end. I think what we lack is spaces where theory and practice actually talk to each other, where more practitioners are actually sitting for 5 days in in the middle of something, right? Where they're like sitting with theory to be like, I hate this, right? Like that is actually more helpful. And what we don't have is that combination of interest. So you have like what they call theory heads, right? Like reading more and more theory and thinking about who's speaking to whom, and they're all dead. And that's never trickling down to practice. But I do think for people practicing to stop and wonder, well, is this human rights complex actually doing the thing we want to do? Like, even if that's the impact of it, that is doing a work in the world, I think. And I don't know, like and you're right, like I come from the totally different perspective of someone who, after 7 years of practice, decided that theory was what I wanted to build and find a lot of productivity in just building theory. But then my day job is also teaching lawyers to be lawyers. So I feel like that's the practice of the theory. But I think as reading it, I totally agree. Like there's something about reading it, um, and I don't think you're being reductionist. I think the amount of reading I gave you was just the introduction. So the piece is that she tackles these big subjects, says no to the human rights complex, and instead says, well, what would it look like if we were more self-reflexive? And I think that's not the answer. The answer is not that we should be self-reflexive. It actually is speaking against a much larger system of presuming that just rights are going to be liberatory, which I don't know, is a helpful one tool to have in your toolkit of many, as one considers it. Yeah.
No, I was just saying, I was sort of feeding into that point, which is that I think that's a slightly unfair reading of Kapoor insofar as also it's not like it's a conceptual rejection of the human rights frame as what it does and what it limits, but it is also fairly openly acknowledging of its practical ramifications and its necessity in the current moment.
Right.
So I'm not sure that she is doing.
No, but I think
just
even
the
if you read
material-
it like that, right? We're taking this like total end conversation thing. Even if you read it like that, the fact that it's going to stick in your head, you think about the fishbowl. So usually when I teach this class over 14 weeks, people reject the fishbowl the first class, right? By the end of it, they'll be like, but it's not like that's a fishbowl response. And you're like, great. Even if that's the metaphor that you've gotten from this, like that's one more tool that you have to imagine futures. And I think that is the point of theory and world building, right? That we have more frameworks to accept or reject the things around us.
Yeah, Professor. Also, the critique seems to be only with regards to the neoliberal understanding of human rights or human rights, how they came
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
1990s,
Yeah.
but not something that is beyond. So it's not about the rights understanding as such, but
No.
only the rights as conceived in the neoliberal human rights project that came up late 80s and 90s, which became dominant.
And which became also very Western dominated in terms of how it was assumed to be good rights. And I think and then thanks for that reminder as well of like how it wasn't about the underlying, because in fact freedom is about rights at the core, at the deepest level. If you think about freedom, it is about the holistic possibility of having true freedom is connected to non-neoliberal rights. It's just not the human rights complex or like the way in which neoliberalism has corrupted it. You still have a hand up. I'm going to give you another chance.
So I think to the extent a critique of the neoliberal human rights project is concerned, like that makes so much sense, and there's so much language that it equips you with when you critique that. My only concern comes from the place that it feels like the alternatives that she's trying to present are to people like her. Like it's like, oh, this is bad, human rights project is bad, but also it's necessary. So something like it's a necessary evil. So we can do this necessary evil by being more mindful, by self-reflection, introspection, all of that. And the concern is when that is presented as an alternative to human rights project.
But I don't think it's presented as a complete alternative. I think it's presented as an adjacent necessity to actually decode human rights better.
So just the starting pages of the introduction, it feels as if she's viewing an alternative to human rights project. And then, there are many places where she acknowledges.
But isn't that true of any legal argument? You start with the most obvious in your face, like analysis, and then you put all the caveats after. Like that's right. Like why would the book not start with like the most critical, the most provocative like version of the argument?
Yeah, absolutely. It can start. It's just that, probably I was expecting something more concrete. For example, like say, okay, no human rights project. let's think about cooperativism. How we can think about negotiating with the more powerful as cooperatives, or let's think about in a more dialectical way, as opposed to just making human rights claims and asking for concessions constantly. So
in
probably
each of
I
the
was expecting
empirical
something like that.
in each, did you have the same? And I'm really curious. Did you have the same expectations of the American authors you read?
Not really. I mean, it did not strike me then.
But that's the point as well, right? Like when critique is made from places that we sort of start from. And I'm not pushing back on critique. I actually agree with you. I think there is a real helpfulness for starting positions to have alternatives, especially if that's the claim that they're making. And I also, having read the book, would say she makes those claims in the empirical chapters that follow. That for a class like this, I simply could not have made you read the whole book. But and I want to move on from this because I want to know what others love, what other theories people love. But I do think there's something about your expectation, like the fact that you had a starting background framework of what the piece had to do is an interesting positionality, because there isn't a I actually read the kind of provocation that Kapoor makes similar to Matsuda and Williams. Not in the same vein, but sort of similar. They're all saying the structure is terrible, do something else, right? I don't think Matsuda gives you an alternative to do. She's like, this is my position, this is my personal experience, this is my narrative, this would be great. And the exact response to someone like Matsuda historically has been, that is too poetic.
Wishy-washy.
That word has been used.
I know.
And that is not enough, that's not concrete enough for the argument you're making. Which the sort of argument that we've been playing in this classroom is that you don't need to have, that also is a liberal ask. To ask someone to have a concrete response to your thing is also sort of like a liberal undertaking. And I would argue that Patricia Williams, like the piece that in 2 hours Shivani had to Vaishnavi had to struggle with, was, like a dense piece that also doesn't really tell you how to teach corporate law differently. Right? Like in fact, I would argue Duncan Kennedy's piece has much more systemic logics of how to bring down reproduction of hierarchy in law school. But there's a reason we didn't read that piece, right? Like these are all provocations. And I want you to let them bubble and take what serves and, leave what doesn't. But I think the assumption that someone ought to have done what you expected them to do in a text is unfair to the reader and the author. Did you have your hand up again? No. No, you can speak.
No, I feel the critique of human rights also and international human rights as a neoliberal project also. Like the way Samuel Moyn critiques it or puts it along with the neoliberal market, so that it's easier to understand where his point of critique is coming from. Like when I can see his point is coming from how the growth of human rights has come up. But here, there's one two mentionings of neoliberal human rights as such. But there's also alternate is something that's not very clear. But also when it's starting and what are the very neoliberal rights that you're critiquing, or every right, or you're also looking into the socio-cultural and economic rights that are not given much importance in the neoliberal market. Maybe if I read the whole book, I may get answers for this, but
yeah, and I think a lot of Moyn's arguments are also in articles where the format is slightly different. And I would argue that Moyn's actually talking to specific colleagues in the human rights field. And Kapoor started to do something totally different, which is like getting three fields that don't speak to each other. And it's always hard to do that, to somewhat sit together. I think maybe what you're picking up on is that perhaps she's also not convinced of how much of an argument it is, because she recognizes how it can get co-opted. And maybe that's something that we're all picking up on as well. But I want to move on from Kapoor. And so does someone else want to introduce themselves? Because we're still doing, that's where we started. We're still doing introductions.
We as well ask this one to introduce themselves.
They just did yesterday.
Yeah.
We have Kranti's introduction. Someone else that hasn't gone, want to introduce yourself and tell us the piece that was most, how much funny. Thank you. Thank you. Someone else want to introduce themselves? Yeah, I said I was going to call on you. I feel like the time has come.
Hi everyone, my name is Serish. I've recently graduated and I've started practicing.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm currently working with an advocate, Suru Mandar, and associatedly with Harsh Mandar also. And my focus is on hate crime, hate speech. So I've been dealing with those issues a lot. And I mean, the reason why I opted for this course was also this, that I was in law school. I used to be very obsessed with like gender, but currently my focus has shifted to another part of my identity, which is religion. So I want to like connect both these things and see how that.
What is the reading that most resonated with you?
I think Leela will because I've read her before also. And I've actually discussed in a classroom setting that reading, and I wish to engage with it more. And see.
And is that what you're going to be working on?
Yeah.
Samrita, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us what reading was most resonated?
I'm Samratha. I'm in the second year of law degree. I study at Nalsa. Kapoor reading was something which sort of.
Kanti, now you've started an entire wave of anti-Kapoor.
It was a new idea that I always had but never acknowledged. There's basic rights, like the concept of, which was again what Vaishnavi was talking about, which I mentioned in the paper I wrote yesterday, was, let's say it comes down to like basic right to choose. Is it actually that basic? There's also a lot of conditioning and normalizing.
Yeah.
So that was something, and that I was like, this concept was something that I always had in my head, but never actually, like I couldn't make it a point. Like it was always there, but never no acknowledgement towards that concept, which suddenly made sense after that reading. Yes.
I actually think that connects also to Ridgway's argument about the background framework, right? So we've been talking about what it means to have the background framework that she talks about is about the individual, but there's also a background framework for what you think is a good law or bad law, and who you think is choosing with agency and who is not, right? So when I teach the hijab readings, and I teach this along with a couple of other anthropologists who write about choice in different country contexts, and the students will always say, well, how do you know when agency starts? And I was like, whoever truly has full agency without socialization, we're all socialized. Some socialization is seen as predetermined much worse than others, right? So for example, wearing makeup or needing to I don't know, like dress in a certain way to be in high school in an American context or in a Western context, like are still gendered scripts that you're socialized into to think that is what performance is. But that is seen as agency. In fact, that is seen as post-feminist agency. But that is not assumed to be predetermined. But it is assumed to be predetermined by neoliberal like accounts of feminism when it's in a completely different country context and when people are choosing what they think of as regressive. And I think that's what's interesting. It's like not just where agency lies, but whether there are background assumptions of who's seen to have agency versus who's not seen to have agency.
I think it happens everywhere. Like it comes down to all the social conditioning in every point of life, where there are so many social standards you have to live up to, so many expectations that you have to live up to that are so normalized you don't even know that you're in conditioning.
Right. Until you stop and someone else pushes back against it or says it's not good, right? Like now I'm really going to think whether to put Kapoor in this class again, right? In a way that I would have never, like, I think that some pushbacks help you differently than others. And I think they're actually helpful. This is why critical conversation is helpful, because it's not rejection of an idea. It's like pushing back to make you reconsider what your stakes are, even if it's to double down and say, this is the thing I want to do. Thank you for sharing. Sahil.
Hi, I'm Sahil. I am also from Chennai, and I'm.
Was that in your round?
Sorry.
Was that in your circle as your primary identity?
No. In fact, Delhi was a primary. But I'm a third year student here at Nalsa, and I think that the reading that most resonated with me was Janet, and specifically because
The governance feminism.
yes,
Yeah.
something that intrigued me a lot in that reading was the way Weber was used. So the piece, refers to his theory of ethics of conviction versus ethics of responsibility, and that sort of that sort of was very intriguing because he accepts that ethics of conviction is you prioritizing, morals and those moral truisms, but at the same time, that pursuit of those morals, when it leads to the invisibility of actual outcomes of your actions, that is something that you should not strive towards. You should be more ethical responsibility oriented. And when you when Janet applies that to
Haley
the
and colleagues.
sorry,
Haley, like,
yeah,
and her colleagues, because it's like an edited volume of a bunch of different people. Yeah.
yeah. So when they sort of apply that to the concept of governance feminism,
Yeah.
when that entire movement itself becomes one with differentiated outcomes and differentiated realities, lived realities for some. The fact that that would then create other lived realities, and when you can connect that with the entire sweaty concepts thing.
Oh, that's a beautiful connection. Yeah.
The fact that that feminist experience could create other chains of actual lived realities and feminist experiences by using those, I feel like that is a very interesting thing to think about.
And you're using sweaty concepts from like the Ahmed version of like how to consider the extension, like when something bleeds,
Yes.
literally. That's a beautiful metaphor. I hadn't made that connection between governance feminism and sweaty concepts. Are you using either of these in your paper?
I did.
Okay. And what are you working on?
So my examples, but it was not that complicated. I feel like my example was one where me and one of my female friends were treated very differently, simply because we were seen hanging out and having lunch together. The fact that she was told that hanging out with boys is a dangerous thing and it's an actual safety concern, while the same act was presented to me as just one of my other bad behaviors kind of a thing. So for me, it was very okay, it's your bad behavior, but for her, it was, oh my god, it's a threat to your safety.
Did this happen on campus?
It's happened in my school.
Oh.
Not person.
I was just recounting the exact same instant, the exact, like word to word, like with a colleague.
And so the way I connected this with the example was that my class teacher, actually justified this entire kind of a scheme, saying that this is necessary for the best kind of and the most equal kind of participation of girls in school. If we don't protect them, if we don't surveil them, they will not be able to do.
That is such governance feminism. That's excellent.
Exactly. So that's what comes to my mind. And I was like, okay, even if you are saying creating these spaces can be seen as a feminist goal, creating spaces where there is fulfilling participation of all genders is a feminist goal.
Yeah.
In the process of creating that, what you're essentially doing is you're creating schemes of surveillance and control, and you are chasing those moral truisms, right? You are having that.
Or you're at least using them in retrospect, which is often what happens. It's not that you're chasing them, you're using them in retrospect when caught.
Yeah, I mean, you use it justify for yourself.
That's right. That's right.
Once you're using that, you are again invisibilizing the kind of lived realities and lived experiences you're giving to girls, to in the school. So I feel like that concept really sat well with the entire example. So.
And I like the use of sweaty concepts as a way to think about how it bleeds not only into the thing that happens, but into outcomes that can follow from it. And how it gets institutionalized as proper conduct or proper behavior. Was the teacher female?
Yeah.
That's a really helpful example.
This was during a parent-teacher conference, by the way. This was not even a normal thing.
And why were students at the parent-teacher conference? Anyway, we're going into facts now. We don't have to go into facts. But that's a really interesting. And the question then arises, would the teacher have said that if no one had actually questioned her, right? Like if it hadn't been questioned, would she have even attached a justification to it? Or would she have, as Samrita was saying, like just gone on with it as the thing that you do because you haven't really thought about it? Which is also interesting, which is like how many of our actions are actually considered without self-reflection, Kranti? Like, or do you actually have to think about them as actions only when contested or called upon or called out for? We have time for at least one more introduction. Maybe somebody new who's just started. Do you want to tell us, where you're joining us from and why you're interested in the class, and maybe one reading that resonated with you?
Okay. My name is Madhuswini. I'm a fifth year student at LL do I have to say why I joined the class? Or
No, just what resonated. Any of the texts that you've read till now that resonated with you.
yeah, for sure. So the normal life book that we read
The
really
Spade.
resonated with me.
Yeah.
Specifically because this isn't the first time I have read of using more it's like civil, not civil, but like more discreet ways of getting inclusivity. So what I'm trying to refer to is a work by Prabha Koteshwaran where she talks about how there's a feminist movement in torts law in India, which is a very interesting way to look at it because in torts law, specifically in the Motor Vehicle Act, if someone dies in a motor vehicle accident, you get compensation. There's some sort of a formula for it, and judges now are giving some sort of monetary worth to homemakers essentially, and so that sort of way of looking at torts law was something that really it's been something that's stuck with me throughout. And so this felt
Because it was valuing household labor?
no, it's just like I would never have thought before that. I would never have thought of torts law as in any way being feminist, or very realistically, I would not have thought of torts law.
So
as
was
being-
torts law being feminist, or was the administrative jurisprudence of that particular reading
that is
feminist?
that is yeah, that's the point. But like it's still. I mean, the other thing is also I just thought torts law was very boring. So like this is a new way to look at it. So I was like, oh, I'm somehow weirdly excited about these cases. So this also was like a similar way to me.
Because the administrative justice that is afforded can be reproduced depending on who the person in power is?
Yeah, it is very. I understand that it's very dependent on the person in power. Yes, but it is still a fresh way to look at a law, like a set, like a class of laws that have just they've sort of been around forever and like traditionally seen as boring sense. So it's like a new way to look at it, and that's kind of what I enjoyed about it.
Great. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Tomorrow.
Okay, great. So let's take a break. We're at 50 minutes. We'll take a break, come back at 10:30, then we'll start today's readings. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to break up into a bunch of groups and work with the blase reading, right? And so I want you to think of it, and you don't have to share with the larger group. I really think smaller group workings is most helpful for this, so all of you can talk. I want you to share in either pairs or smaller, like not more than 3 people, because I think it gets hard to do it in much larger groups. I want you to go out and think of, it can be a personal experience, it can be actually a movie, I want you to think of how blaseness comes up. And I know this is very self-serving because I'm writing the book now. It could be helpful for me to think about how the theory travels. So you're right, academics are the worst. But I'm really curious, like, did that resonate with you? Did that idea of like the shrug of not thinking of something as discrimination? Ali, I was actually thinking of the example you used, the people who said, oh, I know they don't mean it, they're saying a joke, but they think I'm from Pakistan. Like that joke to me is a blase joke, right? Like it is a kind of blase interaction. And I don't know if there are other examples, but I'm hoping we can actually pair off in a bunch of smaller groups and come back and discuss that reading. Yeah.
If possible, can we do it inside?
Totally. Why? Oh yeah, absolutely. So why don't we do it inside? You can turn around and have the chats in groups of where you're sitting. That's totally fine. But yeah, we're doing a. Did you hear?
Yeah, no, it just fell down. I was thinking.
Okay, so let's take about 15 minutes, then we'll start with that reading, and then I'll connect it, and then we'll connect it to Spade and I mean, we can take or leave accidental feminism, but I want the idea of like the accident to be involved in like the way we think about these theories too. Okay, so let's start with the group activity. So be in groups of 2 or 3 and take about 15 minutes to chat about this.